Hello cruel world, my name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a Consultant Forensic Psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you do not have to. So I thought I'd do something a bit different today. Instead of doing a high profile case that's in the media, I'm going to tell you about my own personal case that I've assessed in my role. So this is my USP. What other YouTubers can give you all of this, plus some tepid jokes and mediocre to good looks. So I'm going to tell you about a man who I assessed for a criminal medico-legal case as an expert witness, and he was charged with making indecent images of children. We'll call him Mr. Rodman. As with all the cases I ever talk about on my channel, I keep the clients anonymised out of respect for patient confidentiality and also out of respect for the victims and their families. I change demographic details. For example, I might change his age, where he's from, location, tiny little white lies, just like you do on your CV. However, the essence of my cases are all 100% real. So in this episode, you'll learn about Schizoid Personality Disorder. It's a fairly rare diagnosis and it's not particularly well publicised, not really known about, completely different to schizophrenia. I'll walk you through my own psychoanalysis of Mr. Rodman, and I'll give you a formulation about his risk behaviour, and I'll basically educate whilst you vegetate. Is that a good tagline? I still don't know. You're going to step into the mind of a forensic psychiatrist and you're going to copy my thinking. You're going to see how I formed my opinions to give advice to the criminal courts in this case. And hopefully maybe one day you'll return the favour, if I ever get the urge to know what it's like to be a spotty, bald loser. So this was a case I had around 2 years ago. Mr. Rodman's solicitors asked me to assess him and to write a report about his vulnerabilities, and also the fact that he didn't have an appropriate adult in his police interview. I will tell you what an appropriate adult is later. There's also quite brief mention of schizoid personality disorder within the letter of instructions, and the solicitors wanted me to assess this. So what did I do first of all? Well, I looked at the case papers. So this includes police documents. It's fairly standard for me to be sent these in criminal cases. It summarises the evidence, including witness statements, police interviews, CCTV footage, and not in this particular case, but often I get gory pictures of injuries like, people getting stabbed with slash wounds across their faces, etc. Not that it really helps me in terms of diagnosing, but it's just a routine part of the case papers. For Mr. Rodman, the case papers noted 5 counts of him making indecent images and photographs of children between 2015 and 2019. He apparently had in his possession several thousand still photographs of children from category A, B and C. I was going to tell you about the different categories, but trust me, it's not particularly savoury. It's all about different degrees of penetration. It's going to ruin your lunch. If you're interested, perhaps you can Google it yourself, but I would probably delete your browsing history if I were you. So I read in the MG5 part of the case papers, which is like the summary of the offence, that Mr. Rodman's sister called the police. So he'd been staying over at her house for a few weeks while he was having refurbishments done at his house, and he apparently left a USB stick there. So for our younger viewers, thousands of years ago, before file sharing websites and airdrops, etc., we used to keep files on these things called USB sticks. They were invented by cavemen, I think. A couple of weeks after he moved out, Mr. Rodman's sister's daughter found a USB stick behind a cupboard in the room he was staying in, gave it to her mother, Mr. Rodman's sister, and she opened it out of curiosity, and she saw these indecent photos of very young children. So further in the case papers, there were details of the interview with Mr. Rodman, and during the police interview he said that he had autism, though in fact later turned out that autism was suspected by his general practitioner, as he had some of the traits, but he was never formally diagnosed. So of course it can be feasible for many people to have some of the traits of this disorder, such as being socially awkward. However, that's very different from actually having a formal diagnosis. And one of my pet peeves is when people appropriate mental illness to excuse their criminal actions. Not only are they shirking responsibility, but they're also adding to the stigma in general, and you know they don't like that. So Mr. Rodman denied that the images on the USB stick were his, and he did have his explanations. I will report these later, as they're the same as what he said to me during my interview of him. I personally thought from reading the transcripts of the interviews that there were a couple of instances where he appeared maybe a bit nervous, he might have struggled to find certain words, he was maybe stuttering a little bit. it. However, it didn't seem that there were any problems with the flow of his conversation. And Mr. Rodman seemed to understand all the questions, and he gave decent, appropriate answers. There were no bizarre or nonsensical statements which might have been indicative of delusions, and there was no evidence of confusion, disorientation. And then I looked into Mr. Rodman's police national computer record, which is the formal name for a criminal record, and he did not have any previous offences. So I assessed Mr. Rodman in person in his solicitor's office in Kent, and he said he had a pretty challenging childhood. He was removed and taken into care as a young child. He reported being with various foster families, and he also reported some bizarre memory loss throughout most of his life. He attended a mainstream normal school when he was younger, and he did get poor GCSE grades. He only got 2 GCSEs. After leaving school, Mr. Rodman was mostly unemployed. He did have a few different jobs, including working in Sushi Mania. So sushi is a Japanese food based on fish and rice. Mania is a phase associated with bipolar affective disorder, characterized by being very energetic, speeded up, an increased flurry of thoughts, a flight of ideas, rapid talking, being full of energy, feeling elevated in your mood, acting impulsively. So when you put sushi and mania together, you get a really good value buffet. So Mr. Rodman said he spent most of his time playing online games and gambling. He reported not having many friends, and he had a natural inclination to socialise with people who were younger than him. So I asked Mr. Rodman about his functioning in his home area around Kent. And he was generally independent. So for example, he would use public transport, he would budget by himself, he'd do all his activities of daily living, he was living in a council flat, he would do his own cooking and shopping. So I'm going to let you into a little forensic psychiatry insight here. In my view, asking a defendant during a criminal trial or finding evidence about their level of functioning is essential, because in a psychiatric assessment, when it comes to criminal cases, this is often overlooked by my peers, but to me it gives a real insight on if they are mentally ill, how serious their mental illness is. It can be confirmed or refuted by the level of functioning. So if somebody's severely unwell, to the degree that they're not criminally responsible, so they didn't know what they were doing, then generally speaking, the majority of the time, they struggle with their functioning. For example, they won't be able to budget by themselves. Of course, there are exceptions. So off the top of my head, somebody can have severe post-traumatic stress disorder, which is only triggered by specific reminders, and so they can function normally outside of that context, but when they're triggered with reminders, then they become unwell. Unfortunately, in this case, Mr. Rodman's medical notes were not available, and due to the time pressures of the court case, I went ahead and did the assessment even without them. However, Mr. Rodman himself said that he had some psychotherapy as a kid due to being moved around foster homes so much, and he told me that he saw a private psychiatrist recently who diagnosed him with Schizoid Personality Disorder, which I will describe to you later in this video. Now, crucially for this case, I didn't know whether that was correct because I wasn't sent or didn't have time to obtain a copy of his medical notes. So I don't know whether another psychiatrist really diagnosed him with this or not, but I was suspicious given that he said he had autism and it later transpired that he didn't. Mr. Rodman did try and convince me that he generally struggled to articulate what he meant, and he said that he often did things wrong. But when I asked him for a specific example, he told me that he could not remember. And he said he gets nervous and has no confidence in public and in big crowds. He also said that he's got this tendency to act impulsively without thinking through the consequences of his actions. So again, I asked him to give me an example, and again, he was unable to. He said that he does silly things and random things, such as making fart noises while playing online games. It's a bit immature, but it's hardly an indication of severe mental illness, I'm sure you'll agree. Interestingly, he did not volunteer this to me, but I noticed mention within the case papers of another kind of suspect incident. So a couple of years earlier, when Mr. Rodman was aged 23, he had made a friend who was 13, and they met each other online gaming. And he invited this boy to stay over his house to play Xbox. And apparently they both intentionally lied to the boy's parents. So Mr. Rodman picked up the phone, pretending to be the father of another child around the same age as a 13-year-old boy, but the boy was implicit and was actually present during this phone call. And then weeks later, this boy eventually told his parents the truth, and obviously his parents were worried. They called the police, there was an investigation. However, there was no proof that any crime had been committed. So according to Mr. Rodman, there was no sexual intentions and nothing, sexual occurred. Obviously, he would say that. To be fair, he could be telling the truth, and we should probably assume that there was no sexual activity because that's what the police investigation showed. But come on, let's admit it, it is not a good look, is it? And also the very fact he didn't volunteer this information to me makes him look more guilty. So Mr Rodman had lost contact with his father when he was a child, and he was reunited with him at the age of 18, and his father then introduced him to wider members of his family because he moved on and started another family. So according to Mr Rodman, because of the incident with the 13-year-old boy, this new family found out about it and they were bullying towards him, they were hostile, they would steal from him, call him a pedo. So he also said that he got on with the kids in the family and wanted to be part of their lives, so to a degree he tolerated all this abuse and bullying from the adults. Obviously, I asked Mr Rodman about the alleged offences, and Mr Rodman seemed to insinuate that the images were downloaded to blame him by somebody else, either after he left the house or potentially whilst he was living in the house. He basically thought he was being set up. Mr Rodman said he did not feel he needed an appropriate adult during the interview, as he had a solicitor present at the time. So during my mental state examination, which is what a psychiatrist does to examine somebody's, well, mental state, it's like the equivalent of a physical examination. It gives you an insight into their presentation. I noted that Mr Rodman was a little nervous, maybe, a bit awkward. He struggled to express himself in times. However, he maintained good eye contact and he was able to follow the flow of conversation. I did note that he seemed to have his own agenda. He's very kind of evasive and guarded about some topics, such as the incident with the 13-year-old boy, but he seemed keen to elaborate on other issues, such as explaining in detail why he got on with younger children and really emphasising how he was bullied by the wider family. So to me, there was a certain element of Mr Rodman being in control of the conversation. He did have a bit of a tendency to ramble and go off on tangents, but I was able to redirect him. So I thought there was no evidence of a mood disorder. He didn't come across as particularly depressed. There was no evidence of psychotic symptoms such as hallucinations or delusions. In terms of his insight, he emphasised certain odd traits. He did appear to intentionally minimise certain behaviours or at least excuse them. So let's move on to the conclusions of my court reports, which is the expert evidence I provided for Mr Rodman's criminal trial. So during my assessment, to guide the court, I pulled out all of Mr Rodman's unusual odd personality traits, all his weird behaviours and general features. And the reason that a psychiatrist does this is basically about diagnosis. So it's before we can define a mental illness or a personality disorder, we have to summarise all the features. So I noted a poor degree of educational attainment. I noted that he was socially awkward. He seemed quite isolative, for example, spending hours per night playing online video games, gambling. He had few friends growing up. He was bullied and he preferred to spend time with children. He was slightly odd, slightly awkward. He had a tendency to go off on tangents. And he presented in a kind of childlike manner. I also noted self-reported psychological issues, although he struggled to describe these, such as periodic memory loss, doing things wrong, doing things impulsively, making random fart sounds. So obviously I diagnosed him with flatulent communication syndrome. Not really, I just made that up. But I said that the features of autism, I outlined them in my report, which include difficulty with social communication, as well as understanding and using non-verbal language, such as gestures, facial expressions, as well as jokes and sarcasm. Also, people with autism struggle with social interaction, recognising people's feelings, preferring to be alone, and they also have difficulties with social imagination. They often struggle to predict other people's intentions and behaviour. So I thought that Mr Rodman might have some mild features, but I didn't think he crossed the threshold for a diagnosis. Not only just looking at the features I've talked about from his history, but also his communication during our interview. So for example, he was able to follow our conversation, he was using normal facial expressions, and he was making good eye contact. So again, another insight into my work. A psychiatric diagnosis is more about the feel of lots of different factors. So because I've assessed dozens of people with autism, I know how they present, I know what the feel is, and Mr Rodman was not that. I've done many videos on autism in case you're interested. I've done some related to offending, like John T. Bravery, who is the man who threw a random 6-year-old boy off a balcony in the Tate Modern, Alec Manassian, who tragically killed 10 strangers in Canada a couple of years ago. I should stress the vast majority of people with autism are not dangerous. not criminals, do not commit violence. It just, with my line of work as a forensic psychiatrist, the ones that I see have, by definition, committed quite horrific violence. Okay kids, listen up, because this is the educational part of the video. This is the focus of what I wanted to teach you about. I had to consider whether Mr Rodman had schizoid personality disorder. This is characterised by the following: a lack of social relationships, a tendency towards a solitary or sheltered lifestyle, secretiveness, emotional coldness and apathy. They're described as being withdrawn or aloof, and a rich and internal fantasy world. So people with schizoid personality disorders have a feeling of indifference towards other people. They tend to be distant, they tend to avoid social situations. They also have a preoccupation with introspection and fantasy, and they're indifferent to social norms and expectations. They're generally not interested in sex and relationships. So even though schizoid and schizophrenia kind of sound similar, they're completely different disorders. Schizophrenia is a mental illness associated with delusions and hallucinations. Schizoid is a personality disorder with the features that I've just described. I've done videos on schizophrenia, go check that out, and on personality disorders in general, go chiggly check that out as well. The other thing I'd say is that the social withdrawal can be common in both. So that could be negative symptoms of schizophrenia as well as schizoid personality disorder, but crucially, schizophrenia has positive symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. Schizoid personality disorder does not. So even when people are withdrawn with schizoid personality disorder, when they do speak, they make sense and they can follow conversations and you can follow their conversation. As opposed to, for example, some people with florid schizophrenia who might have formal thought disorder where they jump topics between sentences, so it's really hard to follow what they're talking about. So again, similar to autism, I thought Mr Rodman might have some of these traits, such as solitary activities. He seemed different to some social norms and expectations. So for example, he continued to hang out with the adults in his family even after being bullied by them. But he did have, or he did like some social interests. In fact, he went out of his way to make some friends, even if they were online friends, and if they were younger than him. So he didn't seem to have if he was found guilty, which eventually the judge found him guilty of downloading the pornographic images of the USB stick, then that shows that he did have an interest in sex, which is incompatible with this diagnosis. So why did he have an inclination towards younger children? Well, I thought that could be a combination of his level of maturity or his perverse sexual interests, or possibly even both. However, despite a few of these traits, I did not think he had schizoid personality disorder. Somebody who had schizoid personality disorder wouldn't have gone through such elaborate plans to try and make friends with a 13-year-old boy, or even to try and abuse a 13-year-old boy. And also, a bit like I was saying with autism, he just didn't have that feel of schizoid personality disorder from the rare occasions that I've seen it. Another question I was asked was whether Mr Rodman needed an appropriate adult. So in the UK, an appropriate adult is there to safeguard the interests, rights and welfare of children and of vulnerable people who are suspected of a criminal offence. Basically to make sure they're being treated fairly and they're able to participate effectively in police interviews. So it's basically to stop false concession. We all know what's going on, we've all seen Making a Murderer. I thought that he didn't need one. He said himself he didn't need one at the time. I thought that was reasonable. He had a solicitor present. There was no dodgy false confessions being forced during the interview, no evidence of confusion or bizarre statements. So a good question, I think, to educate the masses is, can you treat schizoid personality disorder? There's not really a treatment that would reverse the personality because it's ingrained, it's part of us. You're going to see my separate video on personality disorder. But you can treat some of the associated disorders such as anxiety and depression, using medication, using therapy. And also you can challenge some behaviours and develop coping skills such as anxiety. So for example, you can encourage somebody to try to go out in large groups and to be a bit more sociable and work on relaxation techniques. You can encourage somebody to try a new hobby. The other issue, of course, that's specific to schizoid personality disorder is that people who suffer this are generally too nervous to do things like group therapy and to talk to therapists by their very nature, so that's like a challenge of treating it. So what happened in this case? Mr Rodman was eventually found guilty. He was given a 3-year prison sentence and he was put on the sex offenders register. I thought it's much more useful in terms of reducing his future risk for him to do sex offender therapy than to treat any supposed mental illness. So, in conclusion for this video, I thought it'd be interesting to give you a bit of an insight into my own personal case, some perspective of what I do for a living. Some other YouTube channels do psychoanalyze people, but they ain't about that life like I am. Mr Rodman was a bit weird. We're all a bit weird to a certain extent, apart from me, obviously. I'm perfect. But crucially, despite the pressures from the solicitors, I did not allow his weirdness to be misinterpreted as a mental illness or a personality disorder such as autism or schizoid personality disorder. I didn't let Mr Rodman appropriate mental illness to reduce his criminal culpability. So instead, I let him feel the strong arm of the law. And let's face it, the law does have strong arms. Obviously, not as strong as these beasts. Before I finish, I just want to say please subscribe to this channel as it reduces your chances of becoming bald in the future, and if you're already bald, it will regenerate those hair follicles, guaranteed, or your money back. Until next time, stay 𝐸𝐵𝐸𝐬, and also, I love you.